Welcome to your custom deep dive. We are so glad you are joining us today. I want you to picture a scene with me for a moment to really put yourself there.
Yeah, it is quite the scene to imagine.
Right. So the year is 73 BC. The Roman Republic is the undisputed, terrifying superpower of the Mediterranean.
Absolutely unmatched.
Its massive, highly disciplined legions are conquering territories left and right, effectively expanding an empire that is going to shape the entire course of human history for millennia. But right at the very heart of this seemingly invincible, perfectly oiled military machine, something completely unimaginable happens.
Something that really shook them to their core.
The Roman Republic is brought to its knees, it is terrified, it is humiliated, and it is bleeding. And not because of a rival empire, and not by a massive foreign army invading its borders.
No, not at all.
The existential threat that paralyzes Rome comes from a handful of men armed with nothing more than kitchen knives and roasting spits.
It sounds entirely like fiction, something a Hollywood screenwriter would invent because, well, reality couldn't possibly be that dramatic.
Right, exactly.
But it is entirely true, and it remains one of the most remarkable, bloody, and genuinely shocking chapters in human history. Today, we are undertaking a custom-tailored deep dive specifically curated for you, focusing intensely on the Third Servile War.
Yes.
This is the legendary, earth-shaking rebellion led by the gladiator Spartacus. In this exploration, we are going to look closely at his tactical brilliance, the sheer, unadulterated panic he inflicted on the Roman heartland, and the terrifying psychological warfare that was ultimately used to stop him.
Specifically, the brutal, ancient practice of decimation.
Exactly, revived by the Roman general Marcus Licinius Crassus.
For this deep dive, we have gathered a fascinating, really dense stack of sources curated just for you. We are looking at comprehensive military history articles that break down the battlefield tactics. We have heavy academic papers, including a truly fantastic piece of scholarship by Mesha N. Facha on Roman military law and the social perception of this specific revolt.
A really crucial paper for understanding the legal side of things.
And of course, we are pulling directly from the ancient historical accounts themselves, specifically the surviving texts of Plutarch, Appian, and Florus. If you are the kind of learner who wants to get past the Hollywood myths, the whole sanitized I am Spartacus movie trope, and uncover the gritty, tactical, and deeply psychological realities of an empire that was ultimately driven by fear, you are in the exact right place. Okay, let's unpack this.
To truly understand how 70-odd guys armed with kitchen utensils could legitimately threaten the greatest military power on Earth, we have to start by looking at the massive powder keg that was the Roman economy in the 1st century BCE.
The economy was just a mess of inequality.
A total mess. The entire engine of this economy, the thing that kept the Roman elite incredibly wealthy, was something called the latifundia.
Latifundia.
Right. These were massive, privately owned agricultural estates. They were essentially mega farms, and the specific way these estates were formed over the preceding decades is absolutely crucial to understanding why this rebellion happened.
As it wasn't peaceful, right?
Not at all. The latifundia were built largely through systemic violence, illegal land grabs, and the relentless, unchecked exploitation of the poorest Roman citizens.
I was reading through the sources, and they mention an ancient law called the Lex Licinia that was specifically designed to prevent exactly this kind of land monopoly.
Yes, exactly.
It supposedly placed a strict limit, stating no single person could occupy more than 500 juggers of public land. But it seems like the wealthy elite just completely ignored it. How did they get away with blatantly ignoring a foundational law like that?
That is the core of the corruption that was rotting the Republic from the inside out. The Lex Licinia was indeed on the books, but enforcement was practically non-existent.
Why?
Because the people who were supposed to enforce the law were the very same wealthy senators and patricians who were breaking it.
Wow.
The dynamic was incredibly predatory. You have to remember what Rome was doing at this time. It was constantly at war, constantly expanding.
Right, expanding their borders.
Exactly. And the backbone of the Roman army was the yeoman farmer, the small, independent Roman landowner. So these poor Roman citizens would be drafted, sent away to fight in Spain or Greece or North Africa for years at a time.
And while they were gone,
bleeding for the expansion of the empire, the wealthy patricians back home were illegally gobbling up their small family farms.
that is incredibly bleak. So a soldier goes off to fight for Rome, and while he is surviving on the battlefield, his wealthy neighbor is effectively evicting his family and absorbing his property into a massive mega farm.
Exactly. The Roman historian Sallust actually wrote extensively about this horrific social dynamic.
Hmm.
He described how the parents or small children of these deployed soldiers were driven from their homes if their land simply happened to border a more powerful, wealthy neighbor.
Just terrible.
Sallust called it an invasion of greed and power, operating completely without limits or moderation. The elites would push out these small farmers, amalgamate all the stolen land into these gigantic latifundia, and then, this is the most critical economic shift, they absolutely refused to hire the displaced, impoverished Romans to work that newly acquired land.
Because paying free citizens costs money.
Right. Instead, they used slave labor.
Because Rome's massive military expansion wasn't just bringing back captured gold and territory. It was bringing in tens of thousands of enslaved human beings from every corner of the conquered world.
Massive influx.
The sources paint this picture of a wildly volatile demographic shift. You have a massive, fiercely disenfranchised slave labor force working these huge, sprawling estates out in the countryside, while simultaneously thousands of poor, displaced, angry Roman citizens are flocking to the major cities because they have no land and no jobs.
It is a recipe for total social collapse.
And as I was looking through the materials, it seems like no single historical figure embodies this ruthless, terrifying consolidation of wealth, quite like Marcus Licinius Crassus.
Crassus is a profoundly pivotal figure in this story, and his background is essential to understanding his eventual clash with Spartacus. Crassus was widely considered the richest man in Rome, perhaps one of the wealthiest men in human history.
But we have to look at how he got that wealth, right?
Exactly. We have to look at how he acquired that staggering wealth. It wasn't through honorable trade or traditional means. He built his immense fortune during the brutal dictatorship of a man named Lucius Cornelius Sulla a few decades before our story begins.
Sulla.
Yes. Sulla instituted a terrifying legal mechanism called proscriptions.
The prescriptions sound like an absolute nightmare in the sources. Can you explain what it actually felt like to live under that system? Because the texts describe it as essentially a state-sponsored hit list, but what did that mean for an average person in Rome?
It was a period of absolute suffocating terror. Sulla would literally post lists of names in the Roman Forum, the public square. These were his political enemies, or simply people whose wealth he desired.
And if your name was on it?
If your name appeared on that list, you were legally declared an outlaw. Your Roman citizenship was revoked. Your life was forfeit.
Meaning anyone could just kill you.
Meaning anyone could murder you in the street without consequence, and in fact, they would be rewarded for it. And all of your property, your land, your wealth was immediately confiscated by the Roman state. Sulla used this method to systematically eliminate around 80 senators and over 2,600 members of the equestrian class.
Just to clarify for you listening, when we talk about the equestrian class in Rome, we aren't talking about men who ride horses for a living. These were essentially the wealthy business and merchant elite. They were the financial backbone of the Republic, situated just below the senatorial class in terms of political power, but often rivaling them in sheer wealth.
Spot on.
So Sulla is wiping out the business elite of Rome. And this is where Crassus swoops in to capitalize on the bloodbath.
Swoops in is the perfect phrase. Crassus was the ultimate disaster capitalist. Once the state confiscated the massive estates of these murdered equestrians and senators, the properties were auctioned off.
Cheaply, I imagine.
Very. Because everyone else was terrified, Crassus was able to buy up these prime, incredibly valuable properties for absolute pennies on the dollar. He built a real estate empire on the graves of his fellow citizens.
It is so chilling.
And his predatory business tactics didn't stop there. He also made a fortune in real estate speculation during urban fires. The historian Plutarch notes a fascinating and incredibly dark detail about Crassus. He maintained a private, highly trained army of about 500 slave architects and builders.
Wait, how does a private slave army of builders help you make money during a fire? Rome didn't have a public fire department at this time, right?
Exactly. Rome had no municipal fire service, and its massive apartment blocks called insulae were largely made of wood and caught fire constantly.
So what did Crassus do?
When a building caught fire, Crassus would arrive at the scene with his 500-man slave brigade. But he wouldn't put the fire out immediately.
Unbelievable.
While the building was actively burning, he would approach the desperate owner and the owners of the adjacent buildings that were about to catch fire and offer to buy their properties at a rock-bottom, insultingly low price.
Blackmail, essentially.
Pure extortion. If they agreed, his men would put out the fire and he owned the land. If they refused, he would just stand there and watch their properties burn to ash and then buy the scorched earth later for even less.
That is just cartoonishly evil.
Afterward, his massive slave workforce would rebuild the structures. He essentially created a vertically integrated, monopolistic real estate empire, completely fueled by human suffering and slave labor.
Which really brings us to the ultimate glaring irony of this whole deep dive.
Yeah.
The sources make this incredibly apparent. The very engine of Rome's immense, unparalleled wealth, its massive, brutally exploited slave labor force, was simultaneously its greatest existential threat.
The irony is inescapable.
The Roman war machine was designed to chew people up, strip them of their humanity, and spit them out into chains to work the land or fight in the arenas. And Spartacus himself seems to be the absolute perfect embodiment of this systemic flaw.
He really is.
The texts indicate he wasn't just a random farmer who was captured. He was likely a Thracian from the region of modern-day Bulgaria. And there is evidence suggesting he actually had formal Roman military experience.
Yes, the ancient sources, particularly Appian and Florus, strongly suggest that Spartacus had previously served either as a mercenary or as an auxiliary soldier in the Roman army itself.
So he knew their tactics.
Intimately. The Roman military often used troops from conquered or allied nations to supplement their heavy infantry. So, Spartacus was a man intimately familiar with Roman military discipline, Roman tactics, Roman logistics, and Roman weaponry.
And then he ended up enslaved.
At some point, either through desertion, insubordination, or being captured in a subsequent regional conflict, he was stripped of his status and condemned to slavery. The Romans took a man they had trained to kill, pushed him to the absolute margins of human endurance, and enslaved him.
And because he possessed immense physical strengths and highly specialized military background, he wasn't sent to work the fields on the latifundia. Instead, he was sold to a ludus.
A gladiator school.
Right. This was a gladiator training school located in the city of Capua, owned by a man named Lentulus Batiatus. I think pop culture gives us a slightly skewed vision of what these schools were like. Can you paint a picture of the reality of a Roman ludus?
We have to completely discard any romanticized Hollywood notions. A ludus was essentially a maximum security black site prison. The men housed there were treated with a level of extreme, casual cruelty that is difficult for a modern mind to fully grasp.
It's brutal conditions.
They were essentially human livestock, trained to peak physical condition purely so they could slaughter each other for the entertainment of the Roman public and the political benefit of the Roman elite who sponsored the games.
And they were locked up constantly.
Yes, they were kept in cramped, heavily barred cells, constantly monitored by armed guards, subjected to brutal physical discipline, and lived with the daily understanding that their sole purpose was to die violently in the sand of an arena.
So you have this incredibly volatile mix. You have all this immense social tension, all this systemic oppression, and highly trained military skill, completely locked up in chains, being pushed to the breaking point. This powder keg just needed the tiniest spark to ignite.
That is all it took.
And according to the sources we were reviewing, that spark finally came from Batiatus's ludus in Capua in the year 73 BC.
The historical accounts tell us that a group of about 200 gladiators within this specific school, predominantly Gauls and Thracians, secretly plotted a mass escape. But, as often happens in these high-risk environments, the plan was leaked to the guards.
A betrayal.
Yes. The conspirators realized immediately that their plot was compromised. In the Roman system, the punishment for an attempted slave revolt wasn't just death. It was prolonged, agonizing public torture followed by execution.
So they had to move fast.
Realizing they had absolutely nothing left to lose, a smaller fraction of the group, between 70 and 78 men, decided they had to initiate the breakout immediately, before the guards could lock down the facility.
And because their plan was accelerated, they couldn't access the armory. The sources point out this wild detail. They raided the compound's kitchen.
The kitchen.
Yes, they armed themselves with whatever heavy, sharp objects they could find. Meat chopping knives, massive iron roasting spits.
Yeah.
And they physically fought their way through the heavily armed guards and out of the city gates. I just cannot get over that historical detail. The Great Third Servile War, the conflict that would eventually paralyze the Republic and require tens of thousands of Roman legionaries to put down, literally starts with 70 guys wielding kitchen utensils.
It highlights both their absolute desperation and their lethal proficiency. Even armed only with kitchen implements, these were professional killers fighting for their lives.
Good point.
But, as you noted, they didn't have to rely on roasting spits for very long. As they were fleeing the immediate vicinity of Capua, they experienced a stroke of immense tactical luck.
What happened?
They stumbled upon a convoy of wagons that was transporting proper professional gladiatorial weapons and armor to another city for an upcoming spectacle. They ambushed the guards, seized the wagons, and suddenly they were properly armed.
A huge turning point right off the bat.
Absolutely. They immediately elected 3 leaders from among their ranks: Spartacus and 2 Celtic Gauls named Crixus and Inimasus. Recognizing that they needed a highly defensible position to survive the inevitable Roman pursuit, they fled south to the imposing, heavily forested slopes of Mount Vesuvius.
And this is where we see Rome make its first truly fatal mistake: sheer blinding arrogance. How did the Roman Senate react when they heard that 70 gladiators had broken out of a school in Capua? Did they panic?
Not in the slightest. The Senate viewed this entirely as a localized police matter, essentially a violent crime spree. To the Roman elite, slaves were barely considered human. They certainly weren't considered a legitimate military threat capable of waging a war.
They just wrote them off.
So the Senate's response was incredibly dismissive. They dispatched a praetor, which is a high-ranking magistrate just below a consul, named Gaius Claudius Glaber. But they didn't give Glaber a professional legion of seasoned veterans.
What did they give him?
They gave him a hastily conscripted militia of about 3,000 men. These were raw recruits, pulled from the local area, completely untrained in complex military maneuvers.
And Glaber himself seems to share this arrogant mindset. The sources mention that when he arrives at Mount Vesuvius, he doesn't even bother to build a fortified Roman camp. Now, from what I understand about Roman military doctrine, building a fortified camp with a ditch and a palisade every single night, no matter where they were, was the absolute bedrock of their discipline.
It was rule number 1 of the Roman military.
The fact that he didn't do this is staggering. He simply positions his 3,000 men to block the only known accessible path up the mountain, assuming the slaves are trapped and will eventually just starve to death and surrender.
Glaber's arrogance was an institutional failure. He fundamentally misunderstood the nature of his enemy. He believed he was blockading a group of terrified, starving runaway laborers.
Instead of a specialized strike force.
Right. He completely failed to realize he was dealing with professional, hardened arena fighters led by a man possessing genuine tactical genius. Spartacus surveyed the situation. He knew his small band couldn't possibly punch through a phalanx of 3,000 men on a narrow path.
So he had to get creative.
So he looked for an asymmetrical solution. He looked at the sheer vertical cliff faces of the volcano, the exact areas the Romans had left completely unguarded because any conventional military mind would deem them impassable.
The ingenuity here is brilliant. The texts, specifically Plutarch, tell us that the rebels found massive patches of wild grapevines growing on the upper slopes of the mountain. Spartacus ordered his men to cut these vines and meticulously braid them into long, incredibly sturdy ropes. Then, in the absolute dead of night, 70 men used these improvised vine ropes to silently rappel down a sheer, precipitous cliff face right into the darkness, completely bypassing the Roman blockade.
What is fascinating here is the profound psychological shock of this specific maneuver. You have to put yourself in the sandals of those Roman militiamen.
Just terrified kids, basically.
They are raw conscripts. They are sleeping in an unfortified camp, completely confident that the enemy is trapped miles above them. Spartacus and his men successfully reached the bottom completely undetected and then flanked Glaber's position.
And then they attack.
They struck the terrorized militia from the rear in the pitch black of night. For these untrained Roman recruits, waking up to the sudden, screaming appearance of highly trained gladiators inside their perimeter caused their flimsy discipline to instantly, catastrophically evaporate.
They just ran.
The Romans didn't even mount a defense. They broke rank and fled in absolute terror, and the rebels easily seized their camp.
This feels like the exact moment the entire paradigm of the rebellion shifts. This wasn't just a desperate bid for survival or an attempt to hide in the woods anymore. By completely routing a Roman military force, however poorly trained, and capturing their camp, the gladiators acquired actual Roman military logistics.
The spoils of war.
They captured armor, standard-issue swords, javelins, and a massive supply of food. They traded in their ornate, specialized gladiator gear for the heavy, pragmatic shields and armor of the Roman Republic. Literally overnight, they transitioned from a band of fugitive criminals into a legitimate, heavily armed rebel army.
And you cannot underestimate the power of word of mouth in the ancient world. News of this humiliating Roman defeat spread across the Italian countryside like a wildfire. Suddenly, the rebel camp on Vesuvius wasn't just a hideout, it became a brilliant beacon of hope for the oppressed.
A rallying point.
Thousands upon thousands of runaway slaves, as well as deeply impoverished free shepherds and herdsmen who despised the wealthy elite, began flocking to join Spartacus. And this influx was incredibly strategic.
Also.
These local shepherds brought intimate, granular knowledge of the local terrain, the hidden mountain paths, and the locations of vital resources. Spartacus, utilizing his prior military background, immediately began organizing this massive, chaotic influx of people into a highly structured, functioning military force, actually drilling them in Roman infantry formations.
I want to pause here and really dig into the tactical reality of this, because
Sure.
it is one thing to have a lot of angry people, but it's another thing entirely to beat professional Roman legionaries in a straight-up fight. How do a bunch of gladiators and shepherds actually go toe-to-toe with the greatest military machine of the ancient world? Let's contrast their fighting styles, because the sources detail a massive difference in how these two groups approached combat.
It is phenomenal study in asymmetrical warfare. The traditional Roman legionary was essentially a heavy infantry steamroller. Their doctrine relied on highly specific, drilled tactics. As they approached the enemy, they would throw a massive coordinated volley of pilum, heavy, armor-piercing javelins designed to bend upon impact so they couldn't be thrown back, and which would render the enemy's shields useless.
So they disarm you before they even get close.
Then they would draw their gladius, a short stabbing sword, and crash into the enemy lines behind the protection of their heavy rectangular oval shields, the scutum. It was a highly disciplined, claustrophobic, shield-to-shield style of combat that relied on the man standing next to you never breaking rank.
And gladiators are trained for the exact opposite kind of fight, right?
Precisely. Gladiators were trained for spectacle, for entertainment. Their combat was almost exclusively one-on-one. It required immense personal agility, spatial awareness, and flashy, fluid movements.
More dynamic.
Much more dynamic. More importantly, gladiators were specifically trained by their masters to brutally target the unarmored, highly vulnerable parts of an opponent's body to ensure a bloody, entertaining death, primarily focusing on severing the arteries in the groin and the neck.
Imagine being a Roman recruit, trained to stand shoulder to shoulder in a rigid wall, suddenly facing an enemy that doesn't push against your shield, but instead rolls, ducks under your guard, and actively tries to slice your femoral artery. The terror must have been paralyzing.
Absolutely paralyzing.
And the sources also heavily emphasize the physical toll of this combat, specifically the environmental factors. The Romans were fighting these battles in the brutal, suffocating heat of the southern Italian summer.
Yes, the Roman heavy infantry wore armor called lorica hamata, which is a dense, heavy form of chainmail. Marching and fighting in tight formations while moving uphill in that gear under the Mediterranean sun was physically exhausting.
And Spartacus knew this.
Spartacus, understanding Roman logistics intimately, weaponized this. He actively utilized Thracian hit-and-run tactics to continuously harass and completely exhaust the heavier Roman infantry lines before ever committing his main fighting force to a pitched battle.
That makes perfect sense.
He also employed wedge formations, a heavy, concentrated triangle of his best fighters, designed to violently pierce and shatter the thin, rigid Roman lines, turning an organized battle into a chaotic melee where his gladiators had the distinct advantage.
I was reading about Roman training methods to understand why they struggled so much here. The sources point out this wild detail. Roman soldiers actually trained with wooden weapons and wicker shields that were intentionally crafted to be twice as heavy as their real iron and wood equipment.
Resistance training, basically.
Exactly. The psychological and physical idea was that after months of training with these massive weights, when they finally got to the real battlefield, their actual lethal gear would feel light as a feather, making them incredibly fast and tireless. But even with this extreme systemic physical conditioning, their rigid discipline completely faltered against the terrifying, unorthodox, and deeply personal killing skill of the gladiators.
It is worth noting that the rebel army did face massive logistical challenges initially. The slaves, having been starved and overworked for years, initially struggled with the sheer stamina and muscle mass required for prolonged, crushing, shield-to-shield combat against well-fed legionaries.
Right, you need calories for that.
But Spartacus was a brilliant logistician. As they continuously won these early battles against the militias, they captured Roman supply trains. They secured better rations, meat, and grain. As their diet improved, they rapidly built the muscle mass and endurance necessary to sustain a protracted, multi-year military campaign against the Republic.
And as they kept winning, capturing Roman eagles and destroying consular armies, the psychological humiliation for Rome deepened from mere embarrassment into profound existential trauma. There is a specific story from the ancient sources that perfectly chillingly captures this dynamic.
The funeral games.
Yes. During the campaign, Spartacus's co-commander, the Gaul named Crixus, eventually split off with his own force and was killed in battle by the Romans, along with a massive portion of his men. When Spartacus heard the news, he wanted to honor Crixus. The traditional way to honor a great fallen warrior in the ancient world was to hold funeral games.
Right.
But instead of forcing slaves to fight to the death for the amusement of the elite, Spartacus took 300 captured Roman citizen soldiers, men who had marched out to destroy him, and forced them to fight each other to the death as gladiators around Crixus's burning funeral pyre.
What's fascinating here is the incredibly potent symbolism of that specific act. It cannot be overstated how deeply this wounded the Roman psyche. By forcing Roman citizens, the supposed masters of the known world, to fight and die as gladiators for the entertainment of a grieving crowd of runaway slaves, Spartacus enacted a total, devastating role reversal.
He turned their whole world upside down.
He held up a bloody mirror to the Republic and mocked the very foundation of the Roman social hierarchy. This wasn't just a tactical military defeat on a battlefield. It was a profound, intentional degradation of Roman dignitas.
And when Rome heard about this,
when the news reached the capital that Roman legionaries were butchering each other for the applause of slaves, it fueled absolute, unbridled hysteria. The Romans were suddenly gripped by the terrifying realization that their entire social order could be violently overturned.
fast forward to 71 BCE, and Rome is in a state of full-blown apocalyptic panic. Spartacus has systematically dismantled and defeated multiple consular armies, the absolute best troops the Republic has to offer. His followers have swelled to an unbelievable estimated number of 120,000 people.
A massive host.
He is essentially marching up and down the Italian peninsula with total impunity, looting estates and freeing slaves at will. The Senate finally realizes that their very existence is threatened. They need a drastic, immediate solution, and in their desperation, they hand extraordinary military command to our old friend from the real estate fires, Marcus Licinius Crassus.
Crassus was a logical, if highly dangerous, choice for the Senate. At this point, the state treasury was severely strained by multiple ongoing wars across the Mediterranean. Crassus possessed the immense personal wealth necessary to finance 6 entirely new legions completely out of his own pocket.
Paying for an army himself.
Combining these newly raised forces with the demoralized remnants of the previously defeated consular legions, Crassus suddenly commanded a massive army of between 32,000 and 48,000 highly equipped heavy infantry. But we must be clear about Crassus's motivations. They were entirely self-serving.
It wasn't about patriotism.
No, he wasn't acting out of a noble sense of patriotism. He was desperately hungry for dignitas, the specifically Roman concept of immense public glory and political prestige.
Because he was in a massive political rivalry with another famous Roman.
Exactly. His great political rival was Pompey the Great. While Crassus was rich, Pompey was famous. Pompey was currently off winning high-profile, glamorous wars in Spain and the East.
So Crassus felt overshadowed.
Crassus knew that wealth alone wouldn't secure his legacy. He needed a spectacular, undeniable military victory to rival Pompey's political clout. Crassus needed to be the savior of Rome.
But Crassus inherits an absolute logistical and psychological mess. He takes command of a massive army, yes, but it is an army that is utterly, fundamentally terrified. The sources are incredibly clear on this point. The Roman soldiers actually feared Spartacus more than they feared their own commanding officers.
Spartacus was like a boogeyman to them.
Spartacus had taken on this almost supernatural aura of invincibility. Crassus recognized immediately that before he could ever hope to beat Spartacus on a physical battlefield, he had to fundamentally change the psychological equation within his own camp. He had to make his men fear him more than they feared the gladiators.
And Crassus got the justification he needed to implement this change almost immediately upon taking command. He ordered his subordinate legate, a man named Mummius, to take 2 full legions and maneuver behind Spartacus's forces to shadow them.
Shadow them, but not attack.
Crassus gave Mummius explicit, undeniable orders not to engage the enemy under any circumstances. However, Mummius, clearly infected with the same toxic desire for personal glory as his commander, brazenly disobeyed.
Oh, wow.
He saw what he thought was an opening, attacked Spartacus, and was humiliatingly, disastrously routed. The Roman soldiers, terrified of the gladiators, simply threw down their heavy weapons and shields and fled for their lives.
They just broke.
For Crassus, witnessing this massive display of cowardice and indiscipline was the final straw. He decided in that moment to institute a regime of absolute terror within his own ranks.
Here's where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
And honestly, really profoundly dark. Crassus decides to revive a military punishment that was so brutal, so extreme, that it hadn't been utilized by a Roman general in generations. Decimation, from the Latin word decimatio, literally meaning the removal of a tenth.
Let's break down exactly what happened, because the mechanics of this punishment are designed to inflict maximum psychological trauma. Crassus rounded up the survivors of Mummius's routed legions. He selected 500 of the specific soldiers who had shown the most egregious cowardice by throwing away their weapons.
Okay.
He divided these 500 men into 50 distinct groups of 10 men each. Within each small group of 10, men who shared a tent, who trained together, who ate together, they were forced to draw lots, a random lottery of life and death.
And loser.
The one man in each group of 10 who drew the short lot was summarily sentenced to death. But the method of execution is what makes this practice so uniquely horrifying. The loser wasn't beheaded by an executioner. He was beaten to death with heavy wooden clubs by his 9 surviving comrades. This specific brutal practice was known as the hustuarium.
I want us to really pause and think about the horror of that.
Yeah.
50 men are being violently bludgeoned to death by their closest friends, by their tent mates, while the entire rest of the massive Roman army is forced to stand there in silence and watch the slaughter.
It is deeply traumatizing.
And the punishment didn't even end there for the survivors who had just been forced to murder their friends, did it?
No, the cruelty was multi-layered. The 9 men in each group who survived the lottery and carried out the execution were subjected to profound, ongoing public humiliation. They were permanently stripped of their military honor.
And their living conditions.
They were forced to sleep outside the protective walls and ditch of the fortified Roman camp, leaving them completely vulnerable to enemy raids and the elements. Furthermore, their standard, high-quality wheat rations were permanently replaced with barley.
Barley?
In the Roman military hierarchy, barley was considered animal feed, or food fit only for deeply disgraced, cowardly troops. It was a daily physical reminder of their trauma and shame.
Now, early on, you brought up the academic paper by Makash and Focha, and this is where his deep analysis of Roman law is absolutely crucial to our understanding. Because as I was reading Focha's work, he points out a glaring fact that makes this entire event even more shocking. What Crassus did was actually completely unequivocally illegal under Roman law at the time.
Focha's paper provides incredible, vital legal context here that is often overlooked in popular histories. Between the years 199 and 193 BC, the Roman Republic passed a series of foundational legal reforms known as the Porcian Laws, or leges portiae.
These were civil rights laws, essentially.
These laws were designed to protect the rights of citizens. Crucially, they guaranteed all Roman citizens, explicitly including those currently serving in the military ranks, the fracius provocationis, which is the absolute right of appeal against summary capital punishment or severe flogging by a magistrate.
Meaning a general couldn't just execute a soldier on a whim anymore.
Exactly. It basically meant that a Roman general, no matter how powerful, could no longer simply play God and summarily execute a citizen soldier in the field without due process. So Crassus's revival of decimation wasn't just cruel, it was an open, brazen, highly public violation of the constitutional rights of Roman citizens.
This brings up a massive question. If it was so blatantly illegal, why risk it? Why risk a massive political fallout in the Senate? Or worse, a violent mutiny from an army of 40,000 heavily armed men who just watched you force them to murder their friends? What is the tactical benefit that outweighs that massive risk?
Crassus did it to entirely shatter existing unit cohesion and brutally reestablish his own absolute, unquestioned authority. By forcing soldiers to violently murder their own tent mates based on a blind, random lottery, decimation fundamentally removed the comforting illusion that a soldier could save himself through his own merit, skill, or bravery.
It broke their individuality.
It taught them that their lives were entirely arbitrary and completely in the hands of their commander. It systematically replaced the natural, organic bonds of loyalty and brotherhood among the enlisted men with a shared, isolating trauma and a terrifying, inescapable complicity in murder.
That That is incredibly dark psychology.
The historian Appian wrote a brilliant summary of this tactic, stating that Crassus demonstrated to his troops in the most visceral way possible that he was more dangerous to them than the enemy. It was a cold, highly calculated psychological reset of the entire army's mindset.
But wait, help me understand the political reality back in the capital. If Crassus violated the leges Portiae so openly, why didn't the Senate or the Roman public demand he be arrested and punished for it? He did this in Italy, right in Rome's backyard, practically a few days' march from the Senate floor, not in some distant, lawless province. Crassus' paper asks this exact, brilliant question. Why did Roman society suddenly grant Crassus the social acceptance to commit this massively illegal act?
The answer lies deep within the scarred generational trauma of the Roman cultural psyche. Fasta points to two vital historical concepts to explain this: Manus Gallicus and Matus Punicus.
Fear of the Gauls and fear of the Carthaginians.
Right.
These terms refer to a deep-seated historical psychosis of fear. Matus Gallicus was the enduring, terrifying cultural memory of the Gauls successfully invading Italy and violently sacking the city of Rome itself centuries earlier in 390 BC. Matus Punicus was the absolute terror ingrained in the Roman mind by Hannibal Barca, who spent years ravaging the Italian countryside and slaughtering Roman armies during the Punic Wars. So you were saying that the Spartacus revolt, because it was happening right in the heart of Italy and destroying their armies, physically triggered those exact same ancient existential fears in the Roman populace.
Precisely. The Romans were gripped by the terror of total social upheaval. They were terrified of the despised slave minority, people they abused daily, violently reversing the social order and slaughtering them in their beds. Fascisa describes Crassus's approach as instrumental leadership.
The ends justify the means.
Exactly. The ultimate goal, which was crushing the slave rebellion and ensuring the survival of the Roman community, was deemed so absolutely critical to their existence that the illegal, brutal means used to achieve it were suddenly justified in the eyes of the terrified public. Pragmatic, ruthless military effectiveness completely overrode strict legal adherence to the Constitution.
And Crassus knew this would happen.
Crassus, being a brilliant political operator, knew exactly what he was doing. He calculated the odds and gambled that if he saved Rome, if he won the war, absolutely no one in the Senate would dare prosecute him for how he achieved it.
And his terrifying gamble worked flawlessly. The historical records show that the discipline in the Roman ranks was instantly, miraculously restored through pure, unadulterated terror. After the decimation, no Roman unit ever dared retreat from Spartacus again. With his massive army now firmly under his absolute terrified control, Crassus immediately goes on the relentless offensive.
He pushes them back.
He begins systematically boxing Spartacus in, utilizing his superior numbers to push the rebel army further and further south, all the way to the very extreme toe of the Italian peninsula, a coastal region called Rhegium.
Spartacus, possessing an acute strategic mind, realizes the extreme danger he is in. He is running out of land. His master plan at this point, according to the accounts of Plutarch, is to hire a massive fleet of Seleucian pirates who operate in the Mediterranean to secretly ferry his entire army across the narrow strait to the island of Sicily.
To start a new revolt there.
Spartacus hopes to ignite a massive brand new slave revolt there, and it is a brilliant plan because Sicily had already been the site of two massive, highly destructive, servile wars in the preceding decades. The infrastructure for rebellion was already there.
But it doesn't work out.
But the pirates prove treacherous. They gladly take Spartacus's massive bribe of looted gold, and then they simply weigh anchor and sail away, betraying him and leaving the entire rebel army completely stranded on the tip of the peninsula.
And Crassus sees his opportunity and traps them there with an unbelievable, mind-boggling feat of Roman engineering. He doesn't just attack them. He orders his legions to build a wall across the entire narrow isthmus of the peninsula. And we aren't talking about a little wooden fence or some stacked rocks.
It was a massive undertaking.
According to the sources, this was a massive, highly fortified 37-mile-long wall from sea to sea, and it was backed by a continuous ditch that was 15 feet deep and 15 feet wide. He completely, physically severs Spartacus from the rest of Italy by land. The rebels are trapped in a tiny geographic pocket with brutal winter weather rapidly approaching, and their captured supplies are severely dwindling.
It is a classic textbook Roman siege tactic aimed at starving a heavily entrenched enemy into submission without risking Roman lives in a pitched battle. But Spartacus absolutely refuses to quietly surrender and starve. He waits for the absolute worst weather possible. During a massive, blinding winter storm, Under the cover of a freezing, pitch-dark, snowy night, the rebels make an incredibly desperate, gruesome move to break the siege. The ancient sources describe a harrowing scene. The rebels took the bodies of their dead, starved cattle, and even the corpses of their own dead prisoners, and threw them by the hundreds into the freezing mud of Crassus's 15-foot ditch.
Just piling bodies into the trench.
They systematically filled in massive sections of the trench with bodies, creating a gruesome, macabre bridge of flesh and wood to cross over. In the chaos of the storm, they breach Crassus's heavily fortified lines and escape the geographic trap.
It is a brilliant, terrifying escape, but you can feel that the writing is finally on the wall. The rebel army is starving, deeply exhausted from years of constant marching and fighting, and under immense psychological pressure, the coalition begins fracturing. The sources tell us that a large splinter group, primarily Gauls and Germans under the command of men named Castus and Canicus, break away from Spartacus's main host due to internal disagreements about strategy.
A fatal mistake for them.
Crassus immediately senses the weakness and pounces on this isolated faction, absolutely slaughtering them in a massive battle. Meanwhile, a massive geopolitical shift is happening that fundamentally alters Crassus's strategy. The political clock is suddenly ticking. Word arrives in Italy that Pompey the Great has finally returned from his wars in Spain and is aggressively marching his veteran legions south toward the conflict.
This development is Crassus's absolute worst nightmare. He hasn't spent all this money and broken Roman law just to share the victory. He knows perfectly well that if Pompey arrives on the scene before Spartacus is definitively destroyed, Pompey will use his immense political charisma to inevitably claim the primary glory for ending the war.
So Crassus has to force a fight.
Crassus is now racing the clock, desperate to force Spartacus into a final, decisive, bloody confrontation. And Spartacus, recognizing that his exhausted forces are hopelessly cornered and facing the imminent arrival of multiple fresh Roman armies, realizes escape is no longer possible. He finally stops running and turns to face Crassus head-on at the Battle of the Salarius River.
This scene described in the sources just before this final clash is the stuff of absolute legend. Spartacus knows with certainty that this is the end. Before the battle begins, as the massive Roman legions are forming up their lines, Spartacus brings his personal warhorse forward in front of his assembled troops.
And what he does next is iconic.
In full view of everyone, he draws his sword and kills his own horse right there in the dirt. He loudly declares to his men that if he wins the day, he will have his absolute pick of plenty of fine Roman horses from the dead enemy commanders. And if he loses, he won't need a horse to flee, because he intends to die fighting. He is choosing to fight on foot, shield to shield, to the absolute bitter end with his men.
It was a profound, calculated signal of absolute, uncompromising resolve to his troops. There was no retreat, no surrender. During the ensuing battle, the fighting is described as incredibly savage. Spartacus realizes that his only possible chance of victory is to completely decapitate the Roman command structure.
Going straight for Crassus.
He leads a massive, desperate, suicidal charge directly at the center of the Roman lines, attempting to personally hack his way through the heavy infantry to reach and kill Crassus himself. The historian Plutarch provides a vivid description of Spartacus fighting like a demon, cutting his way through the dense press of shields and weapons, physically taking down 2 Roman centurions who attacked him simultaneously.
But there were just too many Romans.
But the sheer weight of Roman numbers was simply too great. Eventually, he was completely surrounded by legionaries. He fought bravely, reportedly wounded in the leg and fighting from his knees to the bitter end, but he was ultimately cut to pieces. The exhausted rebel army, seeing their leader fall, broke and was utterly destroyed by Crassus's legions, and Spartacus's body was so badly mutilated that it was never definitively identified or found amidst the tens of thousands of dead on the battlefield.
It is an incredibly dramatic, tragic end to the rebellion itself. But the story absolutely doesn't stop on the blood-soaked banks of the Salarius River, because Pompey did show up.
He did.
Pompey's fresh veteran legions were marching south, and they intercepted a group of about 5,000 desperate rebel slaves who had somehow managed to flee the carnage of the final battle. Pompey's forces easily slaughtered them all. And then Pompey does exactly what Crassus was terrified he would do.
He steals the thunder.
Pompey immediately writes a highly publicized dispatch directly to the Roman Senate. He essentially says, sure, Crassus defeated the slaves in a battle, but I, Pompey, intercepted the survivors and definitively extirpated the war. He completely stole the political credit out from under Crassus.
The ensuing political fallout from the stolen glory is massive and shapes the future of the Western world. Crassus is absolutely deeply enraged. Despite financing the army, restoring discipline, and fighting the massive battles, Crassus is denied the ultimate coveted Roman military honor of a full triumph.
They gave him something lesser.
The Senate, largely to appease Pompey and downplay the terror they had felt, rationalized that Crassus had merely defeated a mob of slaves, not a legitimate foreign state, and therefore only awarded him a much lesser, relatively insulting honor called an ovation. This bitter, intense, simmering rivalry between Crassus and Pompey over who saved Rome would deeply shape the next 2 decades of Roman politics.
Leading to the first triumvirate.
Ironically, their mutual desire for power eventually leads them to form a highly unstable, illegal political alliance with a brilliant, rising, heavily indebted politician named Julius Caesar. This alliance, known as the First Triumvirate, effectively bypassed the Senate's authority and ultimately contributed directly to the violent death of the Roman Republic itself.
But before the Republic falls, Crassus wasn't done making his terrifying point to the populace. He was furious about the stolen credit, but he also wanted to definitively ensure that no enslaved person anywhere in the Mediterranean ever dared to raise a weapon against Rome again. And he executes a campaign of psychological warfare that is permanently scarred onto the very landscape of Italy itself.
The Appian Way.
He takes 6,000 of the surviving rebel prisoners from the final battle, and he doesn't just execute them. He systematically crucifies them along the Appian Way. For those unfamiliar, the Appian Way was the primary, most heavily trafficked superhighway of the ancient world, stretching from Capua, the exact city where the gladiator revolt started, all the way to the massive gates of Rome itself.
It is an almost unfathomable act of industrial-scale brutality. We have to pause and consider the sheer logistical effort required to execute this order. Finding the timber for 6,000 crosses, forging the tens of thousands of iron nails, the manpower required by the legions to physically erect them. The scale of the cruelty was not an accident. It was a highly designed, permanent, visceral warning woven into the daily commute of the empire.
The sources outline the terrifying reality of this. The distance from Capua to Rome along the Appian Way is roughly 120 miles. If you spread 6,000 crosses evenly along that specific route, it means there was a crucified human being dying in agony roughly every 100 feet for 120 miles straight.
A horrifying sight.
And Crassus specifically ordered that the bodies were not to be taken down after they died. They were intentionally left on the crosses to rot for years, picked apart by carrion birds and bleached by the weather. It was a constant, miles-long, profoundly gruesome sensory reminder to any merchant, senator, or slave traveling to or from the capital that the Roman state's capacity for violence was absolute.
Yet despite this horrifically violent end and Crassus's attempt to erase their legacy with terror, the Third Servile War had profound, undeniable ripple effects that slowly altered the fabric of Roman society.
What changed?
Socially, the sheer unadulterated terror that the revolt instilled in the Roman populace over those 3 years did actually lead to subtle but meaningful shifts. Out of a deep pragmatic fear of triggering future, equally devastating uprisings, wealthy Romans slowly began treating their enslaved populations slightly less harshly.
Just out of self-preservation.
More significantly, we see the massive agricultural economy, the very latifundia system that caused the war, begin to slowly shift. The wealthy landowners realized that relying entirely on massive, concentrated populations of brutally oppressed slaves was an unacceptable systemic security risk.
Well, they changed their labor model.
They gradually started opting to break up these massive slave gangs, instead choosing to employ poor Roman freedmen in sharecropping arrangements. It was a slow evolution from pure slave labor towards a precursor of the feudal serf system.
It is fascinating and a little depressing how pure existential fear drove economic reform faster than any moral argument ever could. Now, as we wrap up this massive journey, we have to talk about Spartacus's actual legacy. Because based on the primary sources we have poured over, his actual goal was never a grand, systemic, moral abolition of slavery.
No, it wasn't.
He wasn't trying to change Roman law. He just wanted to escape. He wanted to get his people over the Alps and back to their homelands in Gaul or Thrace to live in peace.
Objectively speaking, based purely on the historical evidence, that is absolutely true. Spartacus was an incredible pragmatist. He was a man fighting purely for the immediate physical survival and freedom of the people following him, not a visionary social reformer attempting to dismantle the concept of slavery, which was a universal institution in the ancient world.
But history remembers him differently.
Yet his legacy completely transcended his original localized intent. Over the intervening centuries, he was elevated into a massive, almost mythic icon for modern revolutionary movements fighting against entrenched systemic oppression. From the Marxist Spartacus League fighting in Germany during the chaos of World War I, to the great Toussaint Louverture studying his tactics while leading the successful Haitian Revolution against the French, right up to Stanley Kubrick's famous, culturally defining 1960 film that gave us the I Am Spartacus moment.
He became a symbol.
Despite his defeat, he became the ultimate enduring global symbol of the oppressed, finding the courage to rise up against a seemingly invincible, tyrannical empire.
So what does this all mean for us today? We started this custom deep dive talking about a seemingly invincible global superpower brought to its absolute knees by 70 desperate men with kitchen knives. We have deeply explored the tactical brilliance of a marginalized gladiator, the massive, rotting structural vulnerabilities of an economy built entirely on forced labor and greed, and the chilling sociopathic lengths to which a man like Crassus would go.
Reviving the ancient horror of decimation.
And violating the constitutional rights of his own citizens to brutally reassert control over a panicked society. You've heard the specific gritty tactics, the high-stakes political maneuvering, and the brutal, unvarnished reality of the Third Servile War.
Looking closely at these sources forces us to confront broader, universal themes of centralized power, the societal mechanics of fear, and the incredible enduring capacity for human endurance in the face of absolute tyranny. The Roman Republic managed to physically survive Spartacus, yes, but the subsequent cynical political maneuvering of Crassus and Pompey that directly followed the war laid the immediate groundwork for the Republic's ultimate bloody downfall.
That is a fascinating point.
Which leaves us with a deeply provocative final thought for you to consider. If a rebellion that was so utterly, systematically, and brutally crushed still managed to traumatize the most powerful empire on Earth to such a degree that it forced them to change their cultural behavior and slowly alter their entire agricultural economy out of sheer lingering terror, well, who actually won the Third Servile War?
That is absolutely something to mull over. Thank you for joining us on this custom deep dive. Keep questioning the history you've been taught, keep looking closely past the sanitized Hollywood myths, and keep actively seeking out those profound aha moments. Until next time.